Hi, Heather.
Hi. So the first real question is, who was Laura Perls to you?
So Laura Perls to me was someone I had heard about first during my initial training. Ironically, it was Isidore that mentioned her. Actually, it was before my training. I first saw Laura at a conference of the anniversary of the Gestalt Institute of Cleveland on a mind, body, spirit conference. And she gave the keynote address. And at that point, she was this innocuous little old lady who was hunched over the podium and had the clearest eyes I've ever seen. And I didn't quite know who she was historically. I loved what she was saying because that's what I was there for, around body and Gestalt. And I was about to enter my training. So for me, she was one of the generators of my interest in going farther in the training. But I didn't have any personal contact with her at that time. So she was kind of a beacon for me. And to continue, to continue about, I did the training, which ended up being about a year and a half more. It was very intense, a month at a time, a week at a time, another 2 weeks. It was, and was in graduate school at the same time. So jumped from my master's to my PhD, and somewhere in there, the Institute was offering a workshop. It was a weekend with Laura Perls. So I went to the workshop, and I found what I was looking for in Gestalt. What I found was somebody who effortlessly wove people's style and language with their bodily process, their somatic style, as she would call it, style. She was a brighter beacon for me. It was a little bit, that's who I want to be when I grow up. And then I was with her maybe 4 more times in Cleveland. And then there was a woman by the name of Kay Miller here in Pittsburgh, who was a Feldenkrais Rubenfeld teacher, who got to know Laura, and she brought her back a couple more times here. So I had more time with her here. She, for me, is someone who put together my interest in lived body. I didn't have the words for it to that. From years of athletics and being, I think probably being a trauma survivor and feeling things so viscerally, with how to work with people and themes and styles and development. That's who she became for me. And I was telling a story in the workshop it was on the weekend, this weekend, about Laura's minimalist style. I mean, minimalist. It's so interesting, all the people in Gestalt who have volumes to say about Laura, and I found her to be so pithy. She said a couple things. I did a couple pieces of work with her, and I remember doing one, and she commented on my anger, the way I was being angry. It was so helpful. And she could be very direct, and yet I never felt judged or devalued or punctured or shamed, none in the slightest, partly because she was very neutral. And I said something like, let me tell you how I got here, sort of from what the pain that was coming up. And she just said something like, oh, please do. And I told her what happened. And then she looked at me and smiled and said, I said, well, and she said, well, I just want to really know how that was for you. How was that for you? And that question was the most open, developmentally appropriate thing for me, given the wound. She did what didn't happen when I was a child. we were talking about in this weekend, she asked me how something was for me. Not was my tale of woe, and I had a big tale of woe. It was a lot of woe, but that wasn't it. She wanted to know how it was for me and in a way how I was carrying it. And that, to me, has the largest influence in how I work than any other approach that I run across. I will tell one other experience. Just there was a woman, I think, I don't mention if I mentioned this in the Gestalt humans, so it may be redundant, but there was a woman in the workshop who had, I think I said this about a withered hand. She was in the workshop and she was born that way, really cool woman. And no one said anything to her about it at all. Everyone like looked above her hand and talked around. And Laura, she came up to Laura and Laura said, yeah, what happened to your hand? And the woman said, oh, well, and this is, and I've really done a lot of work. And she started to tear up and said, thanks for acting like I'm not invisible. Mm. What I was struck with, and who Laura was for me, is someone who trusted the integrity of her inquiry to support the impact of it with the person, but not to get cutesy and not to decide for the person what was too much, but to be there to support, as she would say, enough support for contact. And that just the obvious. And a lot of us looked around at each other and said, oh, why didn't we say that? And my answer was, in that moment, because of my shame and discomfort, I couldn't ask that. And Laura had that clear for her. You know, that sense of the genuineness of her inquiry was clear to her, rather than her any sort of pity for the woman or judgment. And there wasn't there. But what I was struck with is how clear she was with that in her. She had to be to do that. And I asked her about it. And on the break, and she said, you have so many questions. I said, well, I want to learn. And she said, I saw her. This is obvious about her. I'm interested in her. Wow. Yeah. So for me, she's not only a person of integration of the somatic, as I know she is for Ruella and other people. She's also a beacon around integrity and clarity and inquiring. And being willing to stay in contact through the inquiry. Like to not say, well, who did I remind you of when I asked you that little two-step thing? She was like, I asked you, yeah. Those two examples are what got me interested in coming back again and again.
Yeah, and I mean, with that, you really hit a lot of the sort of other questions that I tend to prod with a little bit about how you saw her work and what aspects of it struck you. I am curious how you saw her influence or her transcendence in Gestalt and in your own work. Or in your person.
Oh, yeah. A couple of answers to that. One time at AAGT, that organization, we had an interest group on somatic process. And I remember it was Gail and Ruella, and there was a bunch of people. And we all sat down. This was in Cleveland, when it was in Cleveland. I was the first one I was at that we had in the interest group. And we all just started talking about how we got here. And we all mentioned Laura. Everyone mentioned Laura. And I thought, later I thought, yeah, that was what we had in common. She is what we had in common. And the influence that's one place I saw it. I think for me, for my mentor, Tom Cotolo, I think definitely for Jim Kepner as well, her influence, legacy is around the body as self and the selfing process. This whole notion that the Cleveland Institute uses, but doesn't really a lot name because people forget where it came from. The notion of a contact style is Laura's. You know, the way in which people develop a repertoire and a way of managing themselves and being themselves, and that sometimes there are deficits for us in our style. The quote is, some people don't have a developed style. And I thought, yeah, she's right. Or unintegrated. The notion of that, not as a judgment pathologically, but as a direction for work, for the work that I think is one of her largest influences. I mean, other people have written, and particularly Ruella would have a lot more to say about how she influenced her. And I have a couple other ways to describe it. One is clearly a contrast to Fritz, and that Fritzy style. I got to know her a little bit, and she, aside, after one of these weekends, came up to me and said, I would like you to join my supervision group in New York. And I would have to say, deeply thrilled and embarrassed at the same time. And I think I muttered something like, why or what? And she said, I like what you're doing and you could use some help. And
a compliment.
She was right.
Yes.
She was right. I really needed a supervisor or someone of her quality. And I hadn't gotten that in graduate school at all. And unfortunately, our children were very young and I had to beg off. And it's one of the largest regrets of my life that I didn't get to go to once a month. I think it was a Saturday morning thing that a lot of people did. I was very touched for years that she asked me, because I wasn't a New York Institute person. And I felt reached for in a very non-gooey way, very seen. And so that invitation piece struck me as a little different than the male historical Gestalt. Not just Fritz, but a lot of other people. Like prove you can, almost like, you know, prove that you really want this kind of thing. There was a lot of that. And also, she said once, I said, well, I really would like, it would be really nice if you were my mother or grandmother. And she said, you wouldn't want me for your mother or grandmother. And I thought, I mean, later I was a little like disappointed, then thought, that took chutzpah to say that. Like, she said, no, I don't think so. And it was such a skillful, honest differentiation without a shaming push, but really, no, don't think so. And I took that away. And a statement she made once, when a couple of us asked her about not writing, because she, a little bit in a different way, like Isidore, was so clear about the theory, and it was transcendent how clear she was. We said, well, why not? She said, well, I don't know if I like to write, but I also, it's the same reason I'm still working. I have children and grandchildren, and I work to help the family. And then she later said, Fritz never changed a diaper in his life. How would he know about early development? And at that point, I was changing a lot of diapers. And I really got the message from her about the difference between the therapist as lived life, as being in the world, and her lack of need for glorification and ego, and that she was doing this incredible work. She was brilliant and wasn't attached to being important, but was really attached to, I think, her own personal life, which I don't want to comment on, and it's none of my business. That's how respectful I feel of her. But also being with and being in a way that just seems sort of casual. Like, I got children and grandchildren. They need money. And that struck me that it's like that thing that I was trained in, is that to be a good therapist, one needs to, she said something, she said, I couldn't keep up with all the books I wanted to read. So I read the New York Times review of books every week so I could stay on top of and then pick some books. And the museum and looking at the paintings is what helps me be a therapist. Those kinds of ways of modestly, humbly being in the world and then being so brilliant, along with the emphasis on body. And there was a woman in one of the workshops who was very stiff and was trying to explore this movement. And Laura was maybe 80 and got up, leapt up out of her chair and said, let me show you how to do that. And she did this deep knee bend and twist of her body and started breathing and then coming back up. And this 25-year-old woman's eyes got fantastically large. And she said, now, Yaya, we'll do it together. Let's do it together. And I thought, later I thought about the availability with her quote, that I use whatever supports her as necessary, a Zen joke, a story, a movement. And part of that was, at that point, was her own physicality. That, to me, is a legacy. The entire Working with Physical Process program in Cleveland, heavily influenced by that and the work of Laura Perls.
So do you think that she was aware of the transcendence of her work and of Gestalt?
I think she was a lot more educated to the theoretical aspects of Gestalt than most people. And having studied with who she studied with, in university, and studying with Tillich and Buber, and she understood the theory of Gestalt quite well, and was not into dismissing other approaches. So I do think she understood theoretically and the contribution. She didn't have that quality of Gestalt is the greatest thing in the world and everything else is bullshit that sometimes and still comes across or is across. She saw Gestalt theoretically in the philosophical context out of what it emerged, because it emerged out of her and Fritz. And so she really had a sense of that, but she was interested in lots of other things. The Bates method for eye vision, yoga. She wanted to know a lot about basketball for me, that I played basketball and how that worked, and like where in your body you move from. I mean, there was a huge hunger for learning other things. As far as her own influence, I know we're short on time here. At this one conference, one of the faculty, who was about a generation ahead of me, was giving a workshop within the conference in the Perls room, the biggest room. And we're all in there. And there was somebody at the back behind the bookcase. And she coughed when this person was presenting, and she was going on about reformulating Gestalt in terms of systems theory. And this woman coughed and leaned forward, and the presenter said, "Oh my God, Laura, you're here." And Laura said, go on, I'm learning a lot. Keep going. And she sat back behind the bookcase. That sense of herself, of making space for that woman, that humility about always learning, felt to me like, although she really believed in what she believed, that there was not an attachment to her influence, but she had to know, when we all attended and we all went further, that, and you know, people in Europe, Nancy, different people, that were all influenced by her. I don't know how she carried it. It looked like she carried it like a loose garment to me. I don't think she was going to like a whole lot of applause and a big hug. That's for sure.
Okay. But what else comes up as you're stirring this up?
Her eyes. Her eyes that had the quality of almost like a bird, like a bird that could really see. There was a twinkle and yet a vision in her eyes, even when I met her, which is late 70s or early 80s. Yeah, late 70s. So just, yeah, must have been late 70s. Yeah. Yeah, that the quality of her seeing and her gaze, the regarde, the way in which she would not only see you, but be in her eyes. There was a reciprocity in her eyes. I've seen a lot of people and know people that look into you and really check you out or see you. And but she had eyes like Thich Nhat Hanh. She had eyes that were soft and relaxed, and yet saw everything at the same time. And that quality, particularly when she talked a lot about exercises to help your eye vision and how people see, what I'm left with was what a visual person she was. And the other thing that is the emphasis on gesture, the cultural, personal, developmental aspects of just any gesture, which has influenced me enormously when I look back. Her encouragement to inhabit the gesture, and we might call try on or feel the felt sense of the gesture, rather than some sort of therapeutics of what it would mean or where you're going to go. I remember saying once to someone, where does that begin in you? And can you feel where that begins in you? Not where are you going, but that she saw gesture as being a large part of style and communication and obviously our developmental history. That's something that really has stuck with me, that I'm aware is in my work because of Laura. All those little gestures that I and we are taught to take for granted and might explain as this or that, it's male, female, or it's your culture. There was a curiosity of the phenomenology of people's gestures as expression and style of self. She was very clearly influenced by European phenomenology, because when I was in graduate school at Duquesne studying European phenomenology when I met her, and was like, oh, that's what that is. Very different than Reich and that kind of approach to body, that kind of steam engine model of discharging. Yeah. I think it was the yoga all those years that may have had something to do with it. So, it's
interesting. And so I guess really the last thing I wonder is just how you sort of feel her in you now as we're talking about this.
In my patience, which I learned from her, in my looking, yeah, I think those two, my eyes and my looking, and my willingness to use whatever would work and not be trapped into archetypal schools of Gestalt. Ideas that this is what a Gestalt therapist does, you know.
Okay.
And two people could not be more different than Laura Posner-Perls and me, I think. Could be more different. And yet, yeah.
Okay. So is there anything else that you'd add?
No, I want to thank you for this undertaking, to what you're doing. It's part of the gender bias that the man gets published even though the woman writes a lot of the book. And he goes around the world and gets famous and becomes identified. And this brilliant woman is not noticed enough historically in her legacy. So I appreciate you doing it.